Ravenheart, Chapter 2, by K.A. Thomas. The whole town was busy preparing for the festivities. It was the beginning of spring, and in just a few hours the annual matchmaking ball would take place. All boys and girls who had lived through at least 15 summers were required by both tradition and law to participate. This would be Ayla's second year to go. The ball took place in the town's center square. Boys gathered on one side and girls gathering on the other. After the chief announced the start of the festivities with the crowning of the matchmaking ball prince and princess, the two parties came together, took dance partners, and paraded around the square in a lively choreographed dance. The prince and princess were chosen by all the young children who would vote the week before the ball. After being announced and crowned with rings of flowers, the prince and princess generally led the choreographed dancing throughout the ball. Ayla knew the dance well, though she had never danced it in the square. Those boys or girls left without partners gathered with their parents on the sides of the square and waited. Many were asked to dance soon after the first lively parade. A few were not asked to dance at all. The boys and girls would dance constantly through the evening, twirling and spinning with great laughter and excitement. The girls wore their hair down and decorated their tangled locks with flowers. The boys wore their best frocks and groomed their beards. Sometime just after midnight, the chief would appear and announce the final dance. This time, each boy would choose a girl to be his final partner, and he would lead her to the floor. Weddings were celebrated in the days that followed. The girls who weren't chosen, or the boys who refused to choose, went back to their families for another year to wait the next matchmaking ball. Children only became adults after they were married, or after they had lived 18 summers. Past that age, a child was no longer allowed to participate in the matchmaking ball, and would join the ranks of the widows and widowers and orphans who cared for each other in their own way. Ayla sat on the floor of her father's home and tried not to think about what was to come. Gerda stood behind her, brushing her long dark hair and twirling the strands into braids. "You have such beautiful locks, my darling," Gerda cooed to her, knowing she was nervous about the night that lay before her. Ayla knew she was different. She was not a dwarf, and there was no boy in this town who would ever choose her to be his bride. Who wanted to marry a girl that was at the very least a head taller than the tallest standing boy? Last year, she had been the only girl to leave unmatched. She watched as the dwarf families shook their heads and turned away from her, either in pity or in shame. She saw her best friends, Corin and Amber, married that year. Since they started their own families, they had not made time to speak with her. Not that they had really ever been her friends. More than once she caught them giggling with the other children about her size, and there were many times that she was not invited to play in their games. "It doesn't matter that my locks are beautiful, Gerda. I'm tall and I'm ugly. No one will pick me." Ayla leaned forward, resting her head in her hands as Gerda began to adorn her braids with flowers. "There's nothing wrong with being an herb mistress or a teacher at the academy, you know." Gerda was trying to make her feel better. By tradition, though not law, women who became teachers or herb mistresses did not marry. A married woman's primary concern should always be her husband, and the jobs were much too time-consuming for women burdened with children. But Ayla did not want to be an herb mistress or a teacher. A part of her wanted a normal dwarf life with children and a family. But there was also something else. It was a desire she couldn't name, just a feeling that lived on the edge of her heart, telling her there might be something special waiting for her in the world. However, Ayla knew she might never discover her true desire. Gerda and Otto had been talking to an herb mistress since the previous spring, trying to get her to accept Ayla as an apprentice. Otto had recently insisted that Ayla include the names of all the principal herbs in her studies. It seemed to Ayla that her days of dreaming were nearly over. Soon enough, she would find herself under the watchful eye of a lonely widow, learning about plants and weeding gardens. "There," Gerda said, slipping the last flower into her hair. Don't you look beautiful, my dear?" Ayla loved the way Gerda called her dear. The woman had always been like a mother to her, even though she had 5 other daughters to look after. As those daughters grew up and took husbands, it seemed the woman was ever closer to Ayla. But Ayla wondered why Gerda insisted on calling her beautiful when she was so very obviously a tall, ugly thing. The dwarfs valued women who were small and had bodies thick around the hips, good for childbearing. Long blonde or red hair twisted into thick braids was considered charming for an unmarried girl of Ayla's age. Ayla had none of these features to distinguish her. She was tall and slender, with unruly black hair that could never, even under Gerda's strong hands, be forced into a braid. Her face was thought plain and too thin-looking, its complexion wanting for a color which the sun seemed never to be able to provide. Indeed, it was widely agreed upon by all of the dwarf community that Ayla's only beautiful feature could be found in her namesake. Her green eyes were deep and knowing, a look that many an old dwarf recognized as a blessing from the Creator God. The front door of the little house shut with a soft thud, and both turned in the direction of the noise. Gerda kissed her cheek. "That would be your father returning. I must have words with him. I'll send him to have a look at you in a moment." Gerda shuffled out of Ayla's room and closed the door, showing the girl a broad smile that Ayla could tell was for show. The woman was tired, and her mind was preoccupied with something serious. Ayla crawled on her hands and knees to the door. She was used to the position, as it was the only way for her to get around the tiny dwarf houses. She leaned her head against the cracks in the door and listened. "What do you mean? Do you want to send her away?" her father was saying in a hushed voice. "Well, isn't it time the girl got to know her own people? She dreams of a dwarf life here with us." "She is a dwarf girl. There's not one reason why she shouldn't." "Otto, listen to yourself. She may have been raised a dwarf, but she'll never be one. She can't be one, and no boy will pick her tonight. You know that." Ayla knew it was true, but to hear it spoken by Gerda, she felt a piece of her heart break off and rise as a lump in her throat. "So she'll be an herb mistress or a good teacher." "That's not what she wants. She wants to lead a normal life with the hope of love and—" Otto's voice was rising. Ayla had never heard him speak in more than just a firm voice, even when she was being scolded. "We all wanted that, Gerda. We all wanted it at some point, but some of us can't have it." There was silence between the two adults for a moment before Gerda spoke. "Don't condemn that girl to a life of loneliness, Otto. You've done a fine job of raising her, and she's beautiful and wonderful. She deserves to go back to her own people. It's time to send her home." Ayla heard the front door slam, and quickly she crawled back to her space in front of the mirror before her father entered. She pretended not to have heard and tugged at one of the flowers in her hair. "Hello, daughter," her father said softly. "Hello, father," she said in calm reply. It was tradition for children to always greet their father's return home from the day's labor with such a greeting. Otto took a few steps toward her and rested both his hands on her shoulders. She looked down at her lap, realizing that only when she was sitting were his shoulders even with hers. "I know you too well," he said. "You have been perched behind that door listening to Gerda and me argue, am I right?" She could only nod. She felt an unwanted tear stream down her face. "Ayla," said her father's calm voice, "you tell me what you want, and I will make it happen." She turned and looked back at him. "I want to stay." It was all she managed before a small sob began, and she put her face into his hands. He stroked her hair, careful of the flowers, and hummed a sweet melody that his wife dreamed of singing to their own child many years ago. "Daughter," he said, "would you be content to be an herb mistress or to teach at the academy?" She shook her head, trying to fight the tears. "No, but maybe I'll grow to like it. Maybe I'll—" She stopped. She could not imagine ever learning to love working with plants or with the tiny dwarf children who stared at her when she walked into the town's markets. Still, they seemed less horrifying than the thought of being sent away from all she had ever known. As much as she wanted something more, she didn't feel strong enough to seize the opportunity to seek it out. "Don't make me go." "I'll not make you go anywhere, but I want you to be happy." He stopped and thought for a moment. "When no one came from the human kingdom to claim you, I knew that the Creator God had given me a great gift. You are a dwarf to me and to Gerda, and we will love you always." He looked into her crying green eyes. "You are so beautiful. Let us not speak of such sad chances, eh? Maybe a boy will take you away tonight, and if not, you have 1 year yet." He smiled at her, and she could not help but smile back. She knew that there was no chance of anyone picking her at the dance tonight, but she felt a small winged hope flutter in her chest. That day, Otto and Ayla did not take their supper with the widows and widowers in the square. It was custom for each family to take in a few of the widows and orphans and provide them with a meal on the night of the matchmaking ball. It was all a part of the spring tradition. Ayla and her father, however, preferred to use the occasion as an opportunity to dine together in their small house. Otto made a fine bean pudding, and Ayla was able to get some strips of ham, dried and salted, left over from winter storage. It was quaint for a spring feast, but Ayla didn't care. She would rather dine with her father than any other company in the world. The sun's pink glow just on the tops of the trees signaled that it was time. As soon as evening lapsed into night, the children would begin their dance. Ayla looked at her plain brown boots the entire way to the town square. She had never got used to the stares of the other children, and she did not want to see any of them on her way to being left out once again. Despite knowing that she would not be picked for any dances tonight, she reviewed the steps in her mind and clicked the beat of that first song with her tongue. The memory of trying to learn that dance was scarred into her mind. Unlike the other children, Ayla had never gone to school. Her father had taught her everything she needed to know, and the chief conceded that it was probably best she learn at home. But when it came time to learn the matchmaking dance, Otto insisted she join the other children. "You'll make friends," he told her. "Besides, I could only teach you to dance like a man." It was a miserable 2 weeks. None of the boys wanted to be her partner, and the girls shot her laughing eyes and whispered to each other. She ended up bent over and dancing with quite possibly the stupidest boy she had ever met. She vowed never to forget the dance, if only to prevent her from ever having to learn it again. It was one of those dreadful days when she had run home and asked her father if she could saw off the bottom half of her legs. "I'll wear my shoes where my knees are, and no one will notice how tall I am." She was sobbing and laughing as she said it, trying to put on a brave face, but wishing also that her father could understand what it felt like to be different. He only sat next to her, patting her shoulder comfortingly. "No, no, you are exactly how you are supposed to be. If they don't like you just because you are tall, then they are silly and stupid, and they are missing out on the most wonderful person I know." He grinned at her and then added, "And besides, your shoes wouldn't fit on your knees." She loved the way he always managed to make her laugh, even when she felt like sobbing. Otto was her father as far as she was concerned, and perhaps never having her own family wouldn't be that bad. She could take care of him as he got older, and perhaps even take up his trade one day instead of being a teacher or an herb mistress. As she arrived at the town square, she looked up and saw that many of the girls were already there. She walked to the right side and stood at the very corner of the stone square. "Perhaps no one will notice that I don't get picked," she thought. "Maybe if I just stand here all night." She raised her eyes from her boots and watched the girls and boys gather around her. She was very aware that she stood at least a head and a half taller than anyone around her. Her cheeks went a rose color, and she sat down. Maybe then even fewer dwarfs would notice her. Golda and Jem were lining up next to her. They were Gerda's twin daughters, her youngest, and this would be their first year to participate in the festival. They had been eligible the previous year, but both girls had come down with illnesses and could not attend the dance. Consequently, the 2 boys who had plans to pick them had not picked at all the previous year. Ayla looked across the square and saw the boys waving. "Golda," Ayla said, getting the girls' attention, "those boys are waving." "We see them," The petite blonde dwarf snapped and waved back to the boys. Her sister followed her lead, and the two of them took a few steps away from Ayla. Golda and Jim were nothing like their mother. In fact, Gerda's children had not lived with their mother in the 16 years she had been a widow. It was custom for any unmarried children of a widow or widower to go to a married aunt or uncle to be raised. Only in the case of there being no living or no fit relative to take the children was a parent allowed to raise a child alone. Gerda spent time with her children every day, but they were the responsibility of Gerda's older sister and her husband. Ayla had met Gerda's sister only once and could not remember her name. In a moment of self-righteousness, she decided the woman's name wasn't worth remembering. She had been pig-headed and rude. Ayla shifted to sit on her knees and looked over to the small platform that sat on the edge of the square. Some of the older men were gathered there now with their lutes and fiddles. The sun had disappeared over the horizon, and Ayla could feel the day turning into night. Torches were lit, and the chief took to the center of the platform. "Welcome, all you people of Glendon Town, to the annual matchmaking ball." There arose a number of cheers from the crowd, and everyone clapped excitedly. Ayla managed to put her hands together a few times. "Tonight we will give away many of our girls and boys to be brides and grooms in the coming week. Here they will pass the threshold into adulthood, and we as parents will watch them come into fresh, beautiful lives of their own." Not me, thought Ayla, as she found her eyes straying back to her boots again. It won't happen to me. Another man stepped to the platform and handed the chief a small piece of paper. The chief cleared his throat and offered a small grin to the crowd. "And now the time has come to announce the prince and princess of the matchmaking ball." He unfolded the paper. His grin turned into a frown. He called the other man over to look at it, and after a confirming nod, the chief cleared his throat. "The prince will be Gustav Urison." There was a small gasp from the surrounding adults and confused looks. The children covered their mouths to hide their laughter as Gustav took the stage and was crowned. It was the boy Ayla had learned to dance with. She felt a knot growing in her stomach. They're making fun of him, she thought. The chief clapped as the flowers were put on Gustav. The boy stood there grinning like a happy cat. Ayla realized he didn't know he was the brunt of some awful joke. "The princess will be Ayla Autodaughter." She gasped when she heard her name and felt her heart beating horribly fast in her chest. Golda punched her shoulder. "Well, get up there, princess." Then she laughed. Ayla stood up, and amidst the shushed laughter of the children and the hushed whispers of their parents, she made her way to the platform. Unwanted tears were streaking down her face. All this time she thought the other children were at least kind enough not to notice her. She thought they would at least leave her alone in her isolation and misery. But now it appeared that was not the case. They had condemned her to public humiliation, leading the dances as a mockery of what she was, a dwarf in human skin. Worse, some girl had given up her privilege to be ball princess so that they could shame Ayla for everything she was, but did not want to be. When she got to the platform, she stood there looking at her feet for a moment before she realized no one was putting a crown of flowers on her head. She looked down, and the chief was standing there holding the crown, unable to reach. Embarrassed, she took the crown and placed it on herself. There was more laughter from the children, and even some from their parents this time. She forced herself to look out at the gathered group as the chief continued with the more formal announcement of the ball. "Ye common folk of Glendon Town, time to make merry and do not frown." They were staring at her. Every single pair of eyes on the square and around was locked on her. They were not friendly eyes. "This night youth will dance, this night they will romance." She could see them smiling and whispering to one another. She knew they were gawking at how tall she was and congratulating themselves on such a brilliant plan. "A matchmaker's ball, it will match them all." Not me, she thought. Not me. No one will ever marry me. "The child has grown to go away from home." After the next verse, Gustav and she were supposed to begin dancing. She turned to face him, trying to look happy, trying not to cry. Just because she knew what was going on did not mean she had to spoil his ignorance by revealing the joke. She wanted to just do the first dance and get it over with. Then she could hide along the corners of the square for the rest of the night. One story ends where a new one begins. Ayla heard the music and saw Gustav put out his hands to her. She tried not to think about what the other children were saying. She tried to forget that this was all a joke. As she tried to push it out of her head how horrible and embarrassed she was, she caught Golda sneering at her from the corner of the square. Her defenses came crumbling down, and she stepped back from Gustav, shaking her head and crying. "I'm sorry," she said. "I can't. I just can't." She turned and fled the town square, sobbing and apologizing as she went.